What you're looking at here is an album called In Your Face by the late 1980s Christian hard rock band Shout. It is part of a moment when evangelical Christianity was really trying to work out what faith sounded like outside the walls of the church. It was loud and it was glam and it was earnest and very sure that belief had to be lived in the middle of ordinary pressure of life. And this episode is not about whether this album is good. I'm going to tell you, I think it is, or whether you should like it. And I do like it. It's probably the second album, that Christian metal album, that I got. And it's quite an interesting one because, again, it's distributed by secular label Music for Nations. This video is about listening carefully to what these lyrics assume Christian life actually feels like. And this fits within the wider Empire of the Sun series, where I look at Christian history, theology, and culture. And we tend not to do that from the top down, but from sort of the lived edges that get forgotten. And it's the point where belief is carried and tested. And sometimes it becomes impossibly hard, or feels impossibly hard, to hold together. So what follows in this video is an attempt to read these songs slowly, not as a formed doctrine or as a propaganda, but as theology under pressure, theology in the public space. And we want to ask what they emphasize and what they refuse to say, and also what kind of faith they think survives at the end. But I just want to say quickly that if you find videos like this useful, or if you stumbled on the channel before, if anything I say has helped you think more carefully about Christianity, history, or culture, then liking the video genuinely helps more people find it. And subscribing to the channel means that these long, slow, careful episodes actually get shown to people who might want to watch them. I'm not chasing clicks. I'm just trying to build a space for patient religious history and theology. So if that's your sort of thing, then you are very welcome here. Okay, let's keep going, because it seems to me that one of the mistakes we often make when we talk about Christian music is that we assume it's doing theology properly, as if it's always asking these questions, that it's always asking, is it doctrinally precise, or is it orthodox enough, or does it explain salvation clearly? And I think that really is a category error, because most Christian songs aren't trying to teach doctrine. When they go out into the real world, what they're really trying to do is survive belief. They're not so much systematic theology as a lived theology, something that you experience and something that you are and that you feel, and that in some respects, perhaps in a non-Puritan way, but you experiment what it's like to live Christianity into the real world. They're what faith sounds like when it has to be carried week after week inside ordinary life. And to me, that distinction is important. And what I want to do in this episode is sit carefully with a set of late 1980s Christian rock lyrics and ask the question in a patient way, not are these songs correct, but actually more, what kind of faith do they assume that people are living? What do they emphasize, and what do they return to again and again? And just as importantly, what do they not emphasize at all? I'm not demanding you like the music, and I'm not asking you to agree with every line, but I'm thinking it's important that we listen to what kind of Christianity these songs think is real. So let's begin with the negative, because the first thing that stands out is that what these lyrics don't sound like. They're not triumphant, and they're not even settled, and they are not emotionally victorious. There's no sense here that faith has already reached the finish line. We don't hear words like, we've arrived, we've got it sorted, and all things are fine now and we can see clearly. Instead, you hear verbs like waiting, holding on, not giving up, keeping going. And that already tells you something theological. These songs assume that faith is lived under pressure, not persecution exactly or heroic suffering, but this erosion, the erosion of the slow wearing down of conviction, the getting tired, and the quiet temptation to compromise, the exhaustion that comes not from one huge dramatic crisis, but from many, many small setbacks. This album is not Christianity at its peak, but it is, like so many metal albums, particularly British ones, although this is American, it is about Christianity enduring. But there's no ambiguity really in these lyrics, unlike the Striper album, In God We Trust, that I looked at last time, because God is everywhere in these lyrics, but God is also rarely speaking clearly. There is this constant prayer language of, oh Lord, I pray, teach me, I'm waiting on you. But these are almost met with no moments of resolution. The song asks for answers, but they do not get announced at any point that answers have arrived. And we see the importance in that, because this is a theology that treats divine silence as part of a normal Christian life. It's not God punishing you, and it's not evidence of being a failure, and it's not evidence of a hidden sin, but just silence. I mean, think of that intertestamental period, that 400 years where perhaps God tends to say nothing. This album can find itself sat in that plane and that time where God isn't speaking. He hasn't left you, but he isn't speaking. And that already places these lyrics in that intertestamental period and close to many of the Psalms, and perhaps closer to the Psalms than this enthusiastic modern evangelical culture of testimony, because there's no emotional climax and there's no moment where everything suddenly makes sense. There's just a continued address to a God who you trust, even when he doesn't explain himself to you. One of the clearest assumptions running through these songs is that faith is not primarily about knowing the right thing. There's no James White style apologetics here, no arguments for belief and no explanations of doctrine. But instead, faith here is about enduring and persistence and refusing to walk away, even when walking away would be easier. I think that's more of a moral definition of faith, and it is an old one. It's before faith was reduced to this assent and agreeing with all the right propositions. It was understood as something real. You know, it had a fidelity about it, a faithfulness in it. It was trust over time. And these songs assume that the real threat to Christianity is not intellectual doubt, it's fatigue. When sin appears in these lyrics, it does not appear as this sort of abstraction. There's no real, even technical language, no depth of theological vocabulary. But when Sin shows up in this album. It shows us compromise and deception and pride and just giving up and choosing the easy road. This is not a doctrine of Augustinian original sin, but it is real Christianity and moral realism. The songs assume that people drift, not because people stop believing the truth, but because they stop wanting to live that truth truthfully. And that's a very particular theological instinct that's found in this heavy metal that went from the church into the world. And it treats the Christian life as something worn away, not fast, but gradually, rather than destroyed all of a sudden. If you had to name one core spiritual discipline of these lyrics, it would not be worship, and it would not even be evangelism. It would be waiting. Waiting on You is not just a song title, it's the theological center of gravity, because waiting seems to assume three things at once. It assumes that God is real, that also that God is not controllable, and that God works on a different timetable to human beings. And it assumes that the believer's task is not to manufacture a fake certainty, but to remain faithful inside silence and delay. And this is not the Christianity of immediacy, it's a Christianity of patience. But these lyrics aren't naive, because they do assume a moral confusion and social pressure and disappointment and betrayal, but they do not tip into despair or lament. So it makes it very different to the British thrash metal scene of a year or so later. There's also no apocalyptic obsession. There's no culture war language that we would recognize today. And there's no demonization of your enemies. The response to a broken world is not to escape it or to dominate it. It's to stay. It's holding on. It's remaining faithful where you already are. That is sort of a theology of presence, a theology of remaining and staying, but not one of conquest. Let's be explicit. These lyrics do not center church institutions or authority structures or denominational identity, political power, or even national identity. There's no sense that Christianity should control society. There's no rhetoric of enemies. But this is a faith lived inside the world, but not a faith attempting to rule it. And I cannot see, having listened to this album through quite a few times and read through with the lyrics, which I must say, whoever put this together, the lyrics, let me show you them. They are so tiny that I've had to get my old man eyes. I mean, look at that. Look at that. Who would think that was a good idea? The good news is I also own the record. So in the end, I was able to use that. They're not trying to rule the world. So much of Christianity today is trying to be ruling the world. But late 1980s, evangelical Christianity seems like it reflected a Christianity that understood itself as increasingly marginal, increasingly pressured, and morally demanding. Part of me wonders, as I've prepared this, that the whole countercultural nature of the style of music was already inside a Christianity that was just fighting to survive, and that dogged remaining becomes important, I think, to this style of music because it was unpopular even amongst the evangelical masses. But it was part of evangelicalism, and to understand why these songs sound the way they do, we have to understand that moment, because late 1980s evangelicalism, I don't think was always confident Christianity. In America, it was post-Vietnam and Watergate, and it was late Cold War, but the Cold War's still going on. The Berlin Wall hasn't quite yet fallen, and sort of the old moral consensus in the Western world has collapsed. That sort of Reaganism has collapsed. The Thatcherite Christianity, the right-wing Christianity, which evangelicalism is often associated with, has collapsed. And evangelical Christianity knew that it no longer sat at the center of culture. And today we look at the rise of Christian nationalism and and evangelicalism pushing for a different world, that I wonder if this is waking up 40 or so years later to the consequences of the 1980s, and with things like Stranger Things. And we are obsessed, I think, with the 1980s and looking back to the 1980s and 40 years ago. But the pressure that the church and evangelical Christianity was feeling at the time is not in its lyrical academic theology, but in the tone, because Christian rock becomes a way of saying, I think, that faith has to be lived everywhere, not just protected inside the church. And once faith is lived in public, everything becomes more messy. So Christian rock is not just a style of music. It's like this translation exercise. An emotional engine of rock music is urgency, loyalty, and intensity. And that gets redirected towards a Christian commitment. And I think that reshapes and begins to reshape certainly theology, because instead of offering neat sermon like explanations, you get this insistence that instead of clarity, there is this repetition, and this repetition of encouragement to ain't giving up and holding on and waiting on you. And I think these lines, which find themselves somewhat within Stryper and Bloodgood as well, that these lines function as vows and promises, but not as arguments, but they are rehearsals for when faith comes under pressure, and faith can come under pressure in the public arena. This brings us to the band itself, and Shout were not subtle, not in the way they looked. Like, you've got very 1980s haircuts there of big hair metal, but they're also not trying to sound academic or ecclesiastical, but they are trying to sound convinced. And I think Ken Tamplin's voice matters in that, because it pushes and it strains and it sometimes sounds like it's actually fighting the song. But conviction in rock music is a form of beauty, even when you disagree, or especially maybe when you disagree. These songs don't invite admiration, but they do invite a response. And they don't say, do you understand this? But they do say, will you stay? In no way is Ken Tamplin doing systematic theology. He's doing testimony, but not the testimony of the polished kind, because this is a testimony that admits frustration, admits delay, and admits dependence. And the constant language of waiting is like a confession, because it says, I do not control this. I haven't arrived, but I am still here. And that is deeply Protestant spirituality and it is not shallow. It is pilgrim language of people treading one further step through their lives. And much of modern music and modern worship music operates in the present tense. You know, the idea that God is moving now and God is speaking now and breakthrough is happening now. And these songs from 1989 don't live there. They live in this future tense, in these vows and promises of I will and I'm waiting and we're gonna. And I think that does matter, because when worship removes waiting, it also removes patience, which stops us trusting in God. And because patience is where most believers actually live. This kind of theology does not produce flashy, shiny Christians, but it does produce stubborn and faithful ones. It produces people who stay and people who endure dryness and people who don't need certainty to remain faithful. And this is increasingly rare, because so much contemporary Christianity trains people to expect clarity and intensity. And when those disappear, faith can feel like failure. And these songs do not assume that. They assume that dryness is normal. This theology refuses dominance and spectacle and emotional manipulation and easy resolution. It refuses to turn faith into bland performance. Waiting in this album isn't a form of being passive. It's about, what do you do when you're under pressure? It's really loyalty under pressure is what waiting is. And it seems to me that one of the most damaging lies Christians tell is that faith, once it's chosen, becomes emotionally easy. These lyrics don't believe that. They believe faith is something you return to again and again while life keeps happening. This album doesn't promise clarity. It doesn't encourage clarity even. It promises and encourages persistence. And sometimes that can be the most honest theology a song or a believer can offer. God bless.